Hey Aaron, do you hear me?
Yeah, hold on. Let me mess with my audio settings here.
Okay.
I think that did it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you fine. How's it going?
Good, good. How have you been?
We're doing all right. We're doing pretty good. Thanks for joining us. Aaron, good everybody. We were just listening to, I don't know if you caught it, we were just listening to this talk from Peter Dale Scott talking
Which
about
one?
the one, it's from Our Hidden History, doing a talk on JFK, Watergate, Iran Contra, 9/11, and these like deep politics events.
Very good.
To
Yeah,
we're
I've
getting
I've
prepped
heard
for
I've heard
you.
a lot of them, but I don't know which year that was
Yeah.
that talk was from. But yeah, that's an area I know really well with
Yeah,
working with
exactly.
Peter so
Well,
much.
exactly. That's why we wanted to get warmed up for your appearance here today, Aaron. We're excited to talk to you. I mean, we talk. The JFK assassination has kind of become part of it's become a meme, or it's become part of the lore of this show. We talk. It comes up like once every couple of weeks. A few weeks ago, I went to see Oliver Stone in Quebec City to do a talk, a Q&A, talking about his new documentary, the new
Oh, you
Through the
you made
Looking
it out there
Glass.
for that. Are you in the area or did you make it out there for that?
Well, I live in Montreal, but I did the drive. I drove
Yeah.
down to Quebec City and made a whole day of it, and went and saw Oliver Stone. It was really cool. I mean, he got I've got the footage of it. I'm going to put on YouTube soon enough, but
Yeah,
he
excellent. I want to see that. I would have gone if it were like feasible, but because I'd heard Jim talking about it, Jim Diagini talking about
yeah.
it for a while,
Well,
and
it
I'm
was
sure it would have been really great. I heard there was a good turnout for it too.
there was a good turnout. It was interesting. I mean, he talked about the JFK stuff a lot, but a lot of it was interesting because he was kind of getting challenged a lot by this kind of very sort of liberal journalist who, of course, had to hold his feet to the fire about Putin and all this stuff, and was like got into a whole back and forth with him about his support of dictators like Castro and Chavez and all this stuff. And Ben Stone kind of was very kind of entertainingly owning the guy repeatedly over and over as he kind of tried to hold his feet to the fire on this stuff. It was very fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
Good. I can't. I'm excited to see it when the video finally gets released. Then because
Yeah.
those they always they do that with him. Oliver has a certain standing to where he does end up talking to people who on the one hand admire his work, on the other hand, like for whatever professional liberal generic establishment reasons, always want to sort of push back at him or be dismissive in certain ways.
Yeah.
He did something with a Washington Post reporter recently that was similar, where she was making these obligatory, like, well, of course we don't think this happened or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
Oliver's usually pretty good in those cases. Though the Colbert thing years ago he did was weird because Colbert was and his audience were so rabidly anti-Russian, and they were talking about Russiagate, and like you go back and look at it now, and it's like, all that stuff has been, the bulk of it, the Russiagate stuff has been debunked, and Colbert looks like a real ass in retrospect.
Yeah,
But
I think
you
everyone
know,
that really swallowed that narrative and really made it their whole raison d'etre in the liberal media for has came out of that looking ridiculous, and all the people they tried to frame as extremists like Oliver Stone look like the moderate, reasonable ones that were like asking critical questions about it the whole time.
yeah, yeah, I didn't believe it from the very beginning because I'm so steeped in what the intelligence agencies do, and also the fact that like blaming everything on America's terrible, terrible enemies that are always conspiring against us, like that is a horse that they have beaten and beaten and beaten, and this dead horse. I'm tired of them beating this dead horse, but it's
Yeah,
not going to
yeah,
stop. It's always Russia or Cuba or China or the Iranians or whatever. Some that justifies whatever the U.S. is doing and or is putting out. Any bad thing that the public is thinking is probably because of propaganda from some evil enemy. I mean, it
yeah.
just is so silly at this point.
The whole Russiagate thing was just funny, just because the Occam's razor explanation was that no one likes Hillary Clinton and she fucking blew it. Her and the Democrats spent $1 billion and just blew it and embarrassingly failed and humiliated themselves. That was always the simplest like Occam's razor solution to that, and it was
Yeah.
always grasping at all these narratives, these like Tom Clancy narratives to explain it away when the explanation was actually quite simple.
Yeah, I mean, Trump seemed anti-establishment and seemed vaguely funny, and those are two virtues to Hillary's zero. So, I mean,
Yeah,
that alone could sort of explain why it would have been a close election if anybody was
yeah.
paying attention.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, while we talked about Stone, I mean, that was why we kind of connected because when I was going to that talk, someone from this viewer of this show reached out and connected us because of how into that kind of stuff you are as well. What's your connection with Oliver Stone? Like, I know he wrote a little blurb for your book. Like, What's that connection about?
Well, years ago, I was at Temple University, and there was a professor there in the English department, which wasn't my department because I was working on getting my PhD in political science. But there was a professor there named Joan Mellon, who's retired. I mean, this was like some of her one of her last years, and I sort of bothered her until she would talk to me. She was very friendly and very nice once we did meet. But I knew that she'd written the biography of Jim Garrison, a big one, and that she knew a lot about the Kennedy assassination. So I wanted to talk to her, and we became friends. And eventually, I go and she's part of this conference at Rider University on the films of Oliver Stone, and I talk to the woman organizing it and basically say like, yeah, I could contribute a paper here, I guess. And so I wrote something really quick, like mostly over the course of a day, and I read it at the conference. And Oliver Stone came later, and I gave him my paper, and he contacted me by email a few days later, and said he really liked the paper. It was basically about how pivotal the Kennedy assassinations were in terms of America's post-war trajectory. And so I point out what changes were made after Kennedy left. And I talked about how Oliver Stone should be given some credit for having the courage to look at this case, because it's actually, I mean, if you've spent much time looking at the case, the thing that jumps out to you is like how much evidence there is and how weak all the evidence is on the other side, the forensic evidence, and then the evidence of what Kennedy was actually trying to do over the years that has emerged. It's just like, it's pretty overwhelming. And so I just went into all of these areas and became friends with Oliver, or friendly with Oliver, and also with Peter Kuznick, who I reached out to. And I was teaching high school, and Peter and Oliver agreed to help me or create this course, an elective course for seniors called Peace Studies of the American Century. And it used their Untold History of the United States as sort of the text, both the book and the documentary series. And we also watched a lot of films that dealt with U.S. imperialism, so in either good or bad ways. So they watched some what I would consider good films like JFK and The Parallax View and things like that. And they also watched things like Rambo 2, Zero Dark 30. I had some people watch Air America, which was that terrible Mel Brooks who's the other guy, Robert Downey Jr., like buddy movie, except it's really about the Air America's cocaine or heroin trafficking operations in Southeast Asia, but they turned it into like a buddy comedy. It's atrocious, but it's historically worthy because they put that in a film. And then I was in contact with Jim D'Eugenio and Oliver around the JFK at the time they were making the JFK documentary, and I really wanted to be in that. I was interviewed for it, and they put me in the film. I'm only in for a little bit. It's more of a cameo. I think that I have more of what I said is actually in the book version that's coming out, because I spoke more about the Wall Street connections to the CIA and C. Wright Mills power elite and the creation of the post-war national security state, the military industrial complex creation, all these things. So but they really only put in the film. If you've seen the longer version of the documentary, I'm in it for maybe 30 seconds or so, talking about of all things Operation Vulture, which was the plan to use nukes to save the French at Dien Bien Phu. And so I am in the film for that, but not for very long. But it's a crazy story. They wanted to nuke the communists somehow, and it was like the French were eventually like, no, this isn't gonna work. You can't nuke them and not nuke us, so please don't do that. Then I've been in, I helped organize this. Basically Abby Martin and I worked together to plan for this interview that she did with Oliver at Oliver's home. It was a joint production between my podcast, American Exception, and Abby Martin's Empire Files. They made a video of this. It's on YouTube. It was doing really well in terms of getting views. It got close to 200,000. And then Oliver actually tweeted something about it, saying, hey, watch this video. Immediately, YouTube basically censored it. They put it like under super adult restrictions, or said it violated US or whatever terms.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. It didn't do anything. There was no real logic behind it, but there's just they're a dictatorship, YouTube is. So, and they're pretty much an arm of the regime. So after that,
Yeah.
that kind of stopped, which was really frustrating for me because, I put time and even some money into trying to get this produced for us in the podcast and Abby's Empire Files. And then they just screw us that way. So
Well,
that
it's something we've
was
covered a
a
lot, like
bitter pill.
in the wake of the Russia Ukraine conflict escalating. The way that that's been used, talk about a deep politics event, the way that then that's been used to crack down on censorship and to like crack the whip on these social media companies, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Twitch or whatever, and like acting as an arm of the security state and having these like NGO backed think tanks going into these social media sites and determining who is spreading misinformation and what qualifies as misinformation, and taking whatever narrative that runs counter to the official United States government approved narrative about this or other events. All of a sudden they have the power to just totally remove that stuff. It's been really alarming to see that kick into high gear and to see most people like supporting it, being like, yeah, it's good that they're doing this. And I think it's a great thing. It's scary to see witness this happen, this escalation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, liberals. I don't even know really how you would define a liberal these days, because the word liberal is related to like liberty, freedom, and free speech is supposed to be kind of the main principle that they would value above all else and believe, is sacrosanct. And they don't actually care. They, for whatever reason, most liberals are like, yeah, good, stop this disinformation. That's what got Trump elected. And so this is a real problem. Thankfully, we got NewsGuard to protect us. So liberals are are a huge part of the problem, and they're really denial of the illiberal aspects of the U.S. empire and the U.S. economic order is really a big problem for creating any sort of opposition to the regime in the US. And I think ultimately, because the right is not a natural ally for those who oppose, economic exploitation and imperialism. If the liberals who represent, let's say, the middle 40%, maybe let's say there's 10% leftists and let's say 40% vaguely liberal people. If these people are pro censorship and everything else, then it's going to be hard to change the course of US politics when so many of them are really on board with the imperial project. That's why I think ultimately it's going to be international factors that allow for any sort of change to the US empire, good or bad. It's going to be because our position internationally changes, because the liberals have totally lost their minds.
Well, I mean, that's one big shift that's happened, right? You're talking about from the age of the liberals in the age of Kennedy versus today, where there was this strain of like liberal Democrats who were critical of the national security state and the intelligence community, and they were willing to like hold hearings and try and get to the truth of some of these matters and hold these intelligence agencies responsible and accountable for the crimes that they commit. And now not only do you have liberals being totally okay with all these intelligence agencies and in fact kind of like worshiping them as these like entrenched institutions that they kind of revere, but now you have literal like CIA agents running in the Democratic Party and like running for Congress and embedding themselves in civilian government. And the liberals in the Democratic Party are okay with it, or they love this. They think it's a great development because it shows that they're the patriotic troop respecting and police respecting types, and they think it gives them this credibility.
Yeah, it's amazing what Obama did in terms of getting rid of the anti-war movement and really anti-establishment sentiments that were rising up in the United States, and also what Trump did to re-legitimize the FBI and the CIA, whose crimes are legion and should never be embraced by anybody to the left of like J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, it's quite something what has happened in recent years as a result of these two figures who are both disasters in different ways. I actually think Obama is quite a disaster for not only his presidency and his sort of re-legitimation of capitalism and the empire, and really his extension of the global war on terror and the Bush regime, the neocon regime, to remake the Middle East, which he did under the guise of like Arab Spring wars that they said, oh no, these aren't wars, these are people's uprisings. But it's nonsense.
Instead of invading Iraq, we're going to arm and fund these reactionary militant extremists to topple governments that we don't like. That's our benevolent liberal way of doing that while engaging in warrantless assassinations and drone strikes also.
Yeah, and they don't have to explain why they're arming Al-Qaeda, and and who knows what the relationship is between the security services and ISIS, but they don't have to explain why they're doing it or why it's acceptable, because they just deny it and the media says, okay, we accept that.
Yeah.
So they're
and
not
people
even
that
asked about it.
And people that ask questions about it are get shunted into this, like, why are you an Assadist? Why do you love Putin?
Why are you a conspiracy theorist?
Exactly. And it's like we understand exactly why that exists, like why, because there's a specific process of kind of being able to cordon off people into that kind of conspiracy theorist camp.
Right.
Well, that's legitimize them.
Yeah, that's what the operations arm. You could just call it the Department of Conspiracies. I mean, that's what they do. They hatch secret illegal plots, and then they lie about them. I mean, that's like pretty much how is that not just institutionalized conspiracy? But then somehow you still have people being like, no, that's a conspiracy theory. So
yeah,
it can't be true.
Well, and because there's also these
telling me what's going on.
Exactly, and there's also these very highly public, outlandish, wackos like Alex Jones who I think exist to fill that exact purpose, so that anyone that does ask these questions gets kind of painted with that brush, and it's like, oh, you're one of these weird far right lunatics like Alex Jones, and you got to wonder, why he's in that role and who, how he rose to that point. It's another question in and of itself.
I think they've done that for a while, though. I think that is the Birchers for a while served that sort of purpose. LaRouche people have served that purpose in the past. Like these different anti-Semitic groups, like the Liberty Lobby, have served that role. I think, wasn't it the Liberty Lobby that put out like Spotlight magazine, and they did some Kennedy assassination stuff. And so by having it to where the nuts are the ones talking about this stuff, it taints it for the people who might, in theory, be interested, which would be, again, liberals who in the past did have some anti-war sentiment. There was what passed for liberalism in the George W. Bush years had moments of lucidity and were reasonable. I mean, if you've ever seen Stephen Colbert when he was at the White House Correspondents'
of course,
Dinner, and I mean, he said many things that were relevant and pointed and vital to be saying, and they almost suggested that he actually had some sort of principled view of politics. But then under Obama, you see that it actually wasn't. It was just liberal complaining. At the end of the day.
Yeah, and now you have, talking about LaRouche, now you have these kind of like LaRouche followers now that are becoming these prominent anti-imperialists as well, that are I think filling that same purpose. Something else that comes up often. Listen, Aaron, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Like, I mean, obviously, we're a lot of these things we talk about often, you can tell, but just wanted to go back to the very beginning, and this idea that of what you talk about in your work, whether it's what do you refer to it as, these deep politics events. The book that you wrote is called American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. I wanted to talk about this idea of the deep state. Obviously, we've touched on it, but the way that this idea of the deep state, especially under Trump, kind of took on this form, and it became the kind of this narrative that, like, oh, if you're going to talk about the deep state, it means you're one of these like right-wing MAGA conspiracy guys. But I wanted to talk about, why you use that word, and like in your view, what constitutes this notion of the deep state and what that means, and how is that different from the way that it was framed during the Trump era?
Right. The Trump era is a important moment in U.S. history and the decline of the U.S. Global imperial project, but also in terms of helping to make sense of our political regime. Trump has done some mischief in Trump-aligned forces. The Trump concept of the deep state is a kind of silly one, where it's basically, it seems to correspond to bureaucrats who are not friendly to the Trump regime. And you don't really, the Trumpian version of the deep state, you don't exactly know what animates these people, except they might be cultural Marxists, and they seem to be really into pedophilia. That's kind of the Trump. I don't know if there's a coherent version of it, because they don't really have to define their terms in that sort of a way, but It's basically like almost like a liberal semi-leftist thing for the Trumpians. Like
Yeah.
that's a strange version of it. But the real term deep state comes from Turkey, which is like Darren Devlet, and it was sort of rumored and talked about for many years in Turkey, and then it all kind of came to a head in 1997 or 98, the Susserlik incident, where there was a car crash in Turkey, and the passengers of the car were like the head of the Turkish police forces, the head of the British security forces, and a beauty queen who had been like Miss Turkey at one point, as I recall, and this guy who was the head of the Grey Wolves, which was a terrorist organization who had tried to assassinate the Pope and was involved in all sorts of drug running and other nefarious mischief. And so this was a big problem because these are people who should not have been in a car together at all. It's kind of like if the head of the CIA was in a car accident with Osama bin Laden, and then you're like trying to
Yeah.
explain that away. It doesn't make any sense. And so it pointed to the relationship to the security services and the political system that has been a big part of Turkish history, staging all these coups and false flag terror attacks throughout the Cold War and beyond. And so the Turkish started to talk about this deep state. Now, it was derived out of elements of Gladio, which was a US project. And so really, you wouldn't be too far off the mark to say that around that time period, the Turkish deep state was really the US imperialism. I mean, more or less.
Yeah.
But the term is important because you understand, and the Turkish example is important because it allows you to understand what kind of governance you're talking about and what kind of institutional arrangements you're talking about that can allow for this form of governance, which is not constitutional. And so how does this operate? Well, it's this organized crime and economic elites partnered with the security services to step in and intervene in managing politics, democracy or otherwise. And so, but basically it's the deep state is typically something that exists in a democracy, because if it's a dictatorship, you don't really need a deep state because the state itself is already a top-down system. But because democracy is not a top-down system, it's supposedly controlled by an informed public who participates in elections and so on, then you need, if you're going to have a top-down way to assert power, it's got to be plausibly deniable and hidden. And that's really the deep state, I argue. And it emerges in America from institutions that existed before World War II. Like there were all sorts of relationships between economic elites and political elites and organized crime before World War II. But during World War II, the US makes the decision, because of Wall Street forces like the Council on Foreign Relations, this is where this was formulated, to become a global empire. And so they plan the US entry into World War II and how they're going to have this global leadership project after World War II, which they did not pursue at the end of World War I, even though they were the dominant economic and industrial power after World War I. I mean, the top economic and industrial power after World War I. It's World War II. They go for global dominance, and they do this after the war, just like they had planned, and they create institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods Conference established the dollar as the global reserve currency. But you also have elements of the planning for the post-war empire that are still classified to this day, particularly a whole section of the report was written by, or overseen, presumably written by Alan Dulles, on sovereignty and security, as I recall. And Peter Dale Scott and others argue that this was likely calling for something similar to the creation of the CIA, that they had planned for this. And so the CIA gets created shortly after World War II, supposedly to do exactly what the name says, centralize intelligence for the president, so he wouldn't have State Department intelligence, military intelligence, or Army intelligence and Navy intelligence and all this other stuff, that you would have the intelligence gathering process centralized. And that was the plan. And then there's one little passage put in, a couple sentences of like, written by Clark Clifford, who's an important character later on in many of these episodes. And this passage says that the CIA will perform other functions and duties as determined by the National Security Council from time to time, which sounds vague, but okay, we'll just do some things. But that ends up being the justification for the entire covert operations apparatus of the United States government. And this is likely undertaken because you want to be able to, if you're people like Alan Dulles and you're a corporate lawyer, you're also working for the government and the intelligence agencies, but you're a Sullivan and Cromwell Wall Street lawyer also, because he was worked there along with John Foster Dulles, and they represent biggest corporate clients in the world. And if the US is going to be the hegemon of the global capitalist system, and they're going to manage the transition away from colonialism by all these separate European powers and sort of have one Western thug buddy alliance of capitalists who are not like the colonial powers, then you're going to have essentially neo-colonialism, because you still want to get all of the material wealth that colonialism was providing for the colonizers, but you want to be able to do it while pretending to be democratic.
You need a few more degrees of separation.
Yes. And that ends up being what the CIA actually does. It intervenes in formerly colonized countries, typically, although not always. I mean, like, depends on how you want to really split hairs here, but like the CIA overthrew the government of Australia in 1975.
Yeah, we were talking about that the other day.
Yeah. They have overthrown the government of the United States at least once with John F. Kennedy. I mean, I'll say the CIA, but really a coalition of, let's say, security forces that is nebulous to this day, but like included elements of the CIA. They have intervened in European politics with Gladio, and I mean, basically, they've just been allowing politics to be run in a top-down way, while them being able to deny it, and that's the point of having all of these entities. And they don't. It's even the president can't really rein them in. Nixon or JFK told de Gaulle that, well, okay, I know people are trying to assassinate you, and gosh, I'm sorry to hear about that. I didn't order that, but I can't vouch for the CIA. I don't really control them. So if they are trying to kill you, sorry. But or Nixon himself is trying to get the CIA to cooperate with him. He goes a year before the Watergate arrests. He talked to Richard Helms and was trying to get Richard Helms to give him information on the Kennedy assassination. So he said, Nixon said he was doing this so he could like protect the dirty tricks department, but probably Nixon recognized that JFK was killed by the CIA, and thus the CIA could be a real impediment to the president acting the way it wanted to.
Yeah.
And so if he got this information, this would be a way to have leverage over the CIA, but they never gave him that information, and then Nixon ultimately goes down.
Ran into some trouble shortly after that, interestingly enough. Yeah.
And so
weird how that works.
These are entities that can't be managed by even the president. They're supposed to serve the president. I mean, they're supposed to be the president's,
and by extension, the people, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in theory, right? So, I mean, it's scary enough to think, okay, the president has a secret police that has legal immunity, right? That would be alarming and not good. But the idea of it being itself autonomous and independent and able to exercise power, that's even worse. I mean, this is what comes up under Nixon. It's like some people are Nixon arguing with Helms over like whether the president should be able to have access to secrets, and whether these, the issue of whether Nixon having the plumbers is so categorically different from the CIA breaking all sorts of crimes all the time anyway. And we're like, how is it better for the CIA to give the CIA this power, but then be complaining about Nixon exercising it? Not that I like the plumbers or think that's a model of good governance, but it's like this issue is a big part of Watergate too. It's where is the lawlessness, or how do you manage lawlessness in a democracy and secrecy? Why can some entities operate with the secrecy that they want, and then others cannot? Why can some entities break the law and others can be held accountable for it? if it's deemed expedient by who knows why Nixon had to go. But these are big issues, and they've created this like black box at the top of US history where we don't really know key elements of like why certain decisions were made, who made them, and for what, to what end. We can only sort of speculate as best we in some areas, or logically argue for certain things. But this is the deep state. This is our conundrum in the US, the system of like, we don't really know who's running things. We know they're lying about some things, obviously, like the Kennedy assassination, of the ridiculous contrived magic bullet theory that itself is impossible. And so we have these blatant lies sitting out there in the public record, and yet we can't do anything about it. That's symptomatic of the deep state and what it represents in the United States.
Yeah. So we've established kind of like what this concept means, the deep state, and kind of roughly who is involved in these power structures, these like covert power structures, who obviously from a number of examples seem completely unaccountable to any like elected official, who seem to operate completely beyond any like domestic or international law and just have no consequences for ever violating these laws, even when you're talking about like committing mass murder campaigns and stuff, just like the most horrible crimes we can imagine. So we've kind of established that. And I just wanted to talk about JFK as well, because once you kind of establish like who these forces, like what these forces are and what they can do, you can talk about a number of what Peter Dale Scott refers to as these deep politics events. Nixon and Watergate is a big part of that. There's a number of these examples. There's 9/11, Iran-Contra. Why do you fixate on the JFK assassination? Like, what is it about the JFK assassination that really brought you into like thinking about these concepts? Like, why is that the kind of deep political event that has for not just you and me, but I think for a lot of people, why do you think that's the way in to start thinking about or talking about these concepts?
Well, the Kennedy assassination, I'm not old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination. My mom actually saw Kennedy in 1963 at the centennial of she was from West Virginia, and she went to the state capitol for like a high school band thing, and JFK spoke there at the celebration. She actually saw him the year that he died, which is interesting, but that I didn't even know that until like, in the last few months. Or last year sometime. But so I don't have nostalgia for JFK in that sort of way. I'm not a boomer, and I'm not like a liberal who really wants to think who's inclined to think that the Democrats are anything great, even at their best at this point, even though I did work for Democrats in the past. I worked on the Obama campaign, and really that's kind of what radicalized me, is the way that he ended up being like George W. Bush in most key aspects.
I think there's a whole generation of not even Americans, but people all around the world that were radicalized similarly by Obama.
Yeah. And so for JFK, the case is fascinating to me. It has been since I was a kid. I saw Oliver Stone's JFK in the theaters. And then I watched it on VHS back when you get those two dual cassette movies you could rent. And so I was kind of preoccupied with that, but then like didn't do a whole lot of research over the years until after Obama. And then I saw Stone on Bill Maher talking about the book JFK and the Unspeakable. And I read that book, and it made me totally abandon the idea of trying to go into politics, because I get a political job after being a campaign worker, because that's like a reasonable step to take. But after reading this and seeing what Obama did, I'm like, I don't want to do this. And so I went in to look at political science, social science, and history, ways of understanding this. The James Douglas book on JFK is great for laying all this out. I think he probably makes some errors and tries to nail down too many facts about the actual plot in Dallas. But setting all that aside, it gives a great overview of the president. And what's notable about Kennedy is that in his presidency is that he represented to me the embers of the New Deal and that kind of thinking in American foreign policy in the American political system that hadn't been totally extinguished by McCarthyism. And he spoke about imperialism and even Western imperialism more overtly than other politicians of the time. And he was more anti-colonial than other politicians. And he really tried to pursue a reasonable foreign policy. And I
He
think he
visited a
came.
lot of these formerly colonized countries as well. Like he took time to actually go and get to know the leaders behind these kind of post-colonial movements as well, and had sympathy for it, right?
Yes, yes, he did, and he came to recognize that the Cold War itself was this enormous structural impediment to him having any kind of policy that would be good for America and good for the world. And really, what he was, so he decides to try to end the Cold War, and he makes a speech about it at American University. And this is cited by people like Robert McNamara and Ted Sorensen as being really the speech to look at if you want to understand what Kennedy was trying to accomplish. So he had the idea that he would do this, and and this is something that makes sense in terms of democracy, because America could be a lot more prosperous and happy if it wasn't wasting so much money and energy and labor on weapons of war, you know, a lot of which never even get used. It becomes its own sort of weird economic activity. This whole arms race and arms production, but then other times it does get used in like Vietnam, and it's a big boondoggle for military industrial complex firms and so on. And Kennedy realized you couldn't really advocate for policies in the developing world that would be helpful for them, because the Cold War would always be justified. You can't do this because this will weaken America. So we must have these hardcore neo-colonial policies. Kennedy thought that he could change that. I mean, that's why Allen Dulles later in his life was asked by a guy who was his biographer, I think it was like Peter Gross or Grouse or something like that. And Allen Dulles turned to him and said, that little Kennedy, he thought he was a god. And what I take that to mean is that Kennedy actually thought he would operate from the presidency on the basis of democracy, that he would pursue policies that would be good for the U.S. and good for the world and bring the world closer to world peace. And this is, I think, pretty clear when you look at his record. Although, to be fair, his administration still, I mean, the U.S. government was still continuing a lot of terrible policies under Kennedy.
Yeah.
And his administration had all of these people from like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So he was kind of schizophrenic in his first term. I think he would have made a lot of changes in his second term, and they knew that. I think he would have gotten rid of Hoover.
Yeah, and he got elected really on a strong like anti-communist platform as well. Like he was not some crusader for peace with these socialist countries. Even if I think it is evident that these changes kind of were in place. I think it's important to point out though that he did run on that exact kind of platform and was responsible himself. He
ran to Nixon's right on Cuba, which is, crazy, because later he's the one having, these conversations with Castro secretly, back channel conversations about normalizing relations with Cuba, really going further than any other president did. But he also, he felt it's this imperative to appear tough in American politics because of the way the media is so owned by these forces and so on. It was always there, and Kennedy had to deal with that. And so it's, you get into like speculating about why he's doing this thing that we can say kind of sucks, like Operation Mongoose. And then you try to correct for like, well, look at how insane the American political system was and the media system was. And he was still trying to do these things. I think that it's really, you have to acknowledge that, okay, when Kennedy is shot there, he has a emissary secretly with the CIA, but not knowing about it, talking to Fidel Castro, and that Castro's response is, "This is a disaster.
Oh yeah,
everything has changed."
Yeah, and I was just going to bring up Castro's response. It's so fascinating to hear that kind of stuff.
And it's also like these American, Chomskyite leftists are like, they think, oh no, Kennedy was just like everybody else. But then you think like Castro is like an idiot or something, like he doesn't understand capitalism the way you do. I mean, the leftists in the U.S. are sometimes quite annoying in that way. It's like,
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And the Russians too. They sent, the week that Kennedy was killed, they send the Kennedys surviving, Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, send William Walton on a secret mission. He's supposed to be doing some cultural exchange with the Soviets. They send him to Moscow to tell the Soviets, we know you didn't kill Jack Kennedy. It was a domestic conspiracy, a right-wing conspiracy, and the quest for peace is not going to happen under Johnson. He's too close to big business. It's going to have to wait until Robert is in the White House. So you're going to have to wait for that. So like it's very clear that this was happening. I mean, why else would they send these people there? Why would why would Castro be saying what he was saying? Sukarno said that Kennedy was killed in order to keep him from fixing the crisis in Indonesia at the time, which is called Konfrontasi. So all these other leaders, but then your American leftists are like, no, that's Kennedy was exactly like all the others. He just wanted more capital accumulation. He just wanted a slightly different window dressing for it. And it's like, that's not really accurate, but these are people that want to think what they want to think. And it's part of why I think the American left is quite useless, is that it apologizes for some of the worst state crimes. But in the Kennedy case, because it brings in the mob angle, the military and what they were trying to do in Vietnam, neocolonialism and Kennedy's policies in Indonesia and even the Middle East and in Africa, it really is a great prism through which to view the Cold War and what leeway presidents actually have to pursue other policies. It illustrates so much about the American system that it's worth studying within reason.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about Castro's response to it all as well is that, like, not only does he point out like, oh yeah, this is an absolute disaster and this is going to have massive consequences for everything that we're trying to build here, but also just like reacting to like the details of the case and the way that the story of the shooting, Castro just being like, no way. Like, I just see him as someone just
come on, he's a communist.
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. No, but even talking about, you can see Kennedy's whole presidency being like this push and pull between these intelligence community interests and his own interests and stuff. And you see like the Bay of Pigs is a good example of that. And you see how that's kind of an internal, that's its own deep politics event where you have these different factions doing different things. And I think from Kennedy's perspective, you can kind of understand, especially after that, where it's like, you guys have now humiliated me. You're forcing me into the kind of going through with these kind of half-baked scenarios that are just not working, and that it's undermining this whole peace process in the first place. And that being kind of a moment where he decides to start explicitly kind of trying to claw back power from these entrenched intelligence and security interests. And that's exactly why they come into such great conflict, leading to his assassination.
Yeah. I mean, this was the great tragedy and road not taken with the Kennedy administration was he should have put his brother in charge of the CIA. He reportedly was contemplating it, but then decided not to go with that. He put in a conservative guy, hoping that as a political calculation, I guess. He put John McCone. And this was he didn't go after them that way. He didn't buy
classic liberal mistake.
Also, yeah, I mean that's what it comes down to. Kennedy, I admire Kennedy by and large, but he had some liberal, silly ideas in that, apparently, because he did not succeed in what he tried to do because he misjudged the actual regime that he was dealing with, because he had a more liberal view of things. Not that he was naive about this. I mean, he did want to get a movie made to warn people that they might try a coup. And Robert Kennedy wanted to get a movie made about the syndicate, the power of the Teamsters and organized crime as a more unified force in the United States that was really a source of great corruption. So I'm not saying that they were naive, full stop, but in thinking that he could pursue the policies that he did, Kennedy miscalculated, obviously, because instead of ending the Cold War, he got his head exploded in the middle of the street. And then Robert Kennedy, it has to be said, thought he could reinvestigate it if he got to the White House, when other people like Jim Garrison were telling him, you need to go public and say that you're coming after the people that killed your brother, put them on notice. Otherwise, they're going to try to kill you. And that ends up being what happens. So the Kennedys were kind of naive in terms of like underestimating the actual systemic evil that they were going up against. And so we've got to like be honest about that flaw in what they were trying to do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that digs at something else I think that I think about a lot, which is like the role that the CIA played in the post-war period, importing all these Nazi scientists into NASA and all these Nazi intelligence assets and security, and bringing them directly into the security establishment. The Dulles brothers themselves were Nazi sympathizers. There was all kinds of Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. government establishing these rat lines following the war. And that's, I think, that's something that gets touched on in JFK, the JFK assassination. The idea that like if these people are allowed to kind of make these kinds of decisions, you are living in like a fascist government. And I think there has been an element of like of fascism, kind of motivating these security establishment types and these intelligence community types from immediately following the war, and that's part of it. That kind of that level of depravity. They imported it,
Oh, they did not. I mean, look at the two countries, Japan and Germany. They did not get rid of the establishment in both countries. The same people that were the political economic elites, minus, some people who were like invisible war criminal roles. But it's just like in the US, Alan Dulles is the CIA guy, the guy running the CIA. But really, that doesn't mean Alan Dulles is the pinnacle of power in the United States. The pinnacle of power is whoever has the money and organizational wherewithal to bend bureaucrats and bureaucracies to their will, such that Alan Dulles is one of those bureaucrats presiding over a bureaucracy, doing what these rich people want done. And that's something that is important to think about. And in Japan and Germany, it was a similar thing, although they actually did save your Alan Dulles types in the Japanese, and I mean, loosely speaking, Japanese and German establishments. People like Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's intelligence chief, gets rehabilitated. Klaus Barbie, Otto Skorzeny, Karl Wolff, all of these people that they use in this intelligence milieu. And in Japan, you have Yoshio Kodama, who's Yakuza, but also Japanese war criminal, and other figures who get rehabilitated and brought back, and in different ways serve the establishment. Like in Japan, the LDP, which is Abe's party, is founded by with hundreds of millions, over $100 million in war material looted from Japan by Yoshio Kodama, who should have been executed as a Class A war criminal, but he's rehabilitated and bailed out of jail by the CIA. And they established this party that has this huge slush fund to basically dominate Japanese politics from a conservative position since the end of World War II. So the US really folds in the two Axis powers, and that this is done to establish, with rehabilitating a lot of Nazis as well. And this basically establishes the US as presiding over kind of like a new anti-communist international. And this serves to quarantine Eurasia and allows the US to dominate the Atlantic and Pacific trade to a large extent, with only really Russia and the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China as the holdouts. And so this was the order that the US put into place, and it relied on a lot of fascism, like literal fascists, and it governed as a fascist entity, more or less. You have the merger of state and capitalism. And that's really the essence of fascism, when it comes down to it.
And ultimately, you have capitalism as pulling the strings of that, and the state just basically being a front for that vast capitalist enterprise, and basically taking their commands from private interests.
Yes, and you could say, I say this: the difference between the Alan Dulles brand of fascism and the like Nazi brand of fascism is that they both represent a partnership of the state and capital, but in the Nazi equation, capital is the junior partner, and in the Dulles formulation, it's the state is the junior partner, and capital really calls the shots. That's I think the difference between these two fascisms.
Yeah. Okay. So fascinating stuff. Aaron. It's I always enjoy pulling up these threads, so I'm really happy you're able to come on to talk about this. This is a subject that comes up often, and I've taken a lot of flack, Aaron, for pointing out the relationship between the U.S. government and Nazis following World War II. So I'm happy to have you backing me up with some facts here.
It's the big question of our time is, how did we get this regime that just is totally operating in a top-down way, and we can't do anything to change it for the better? And like everybody's kind of like, everything has sucked for a while, and it just seems like it's going to get worse. Oh well.
Yeah.
What could we do?
Yeah. So there's a number of different events we can point out, like since the time of, or the post-war period, or the Kennedy assassination. again, there's a number of these kind of deep political events we could spend all day talking about. I mentioned them, a couple of them earlier. 9/11 is, of course, a big one as well. You have a similar kind of situation where, so Nixon is removed. He's gotten out of the way. Nixon is out of the way, which has basically had to happen in order to kick off the whole Reagan era. Then you've got basically about 20 years of this kind of bipartisan consensus, the Reagan era and the Clinton era, which coincides with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, they have no more like big bad enemy to hold up as this vast communist conspiracy. And then there's 9/11, which happens, which then kicks off this whole other 20-year war on terror, the creation of these vast new intelligence bureaucracies, and this again a nonstop money printer going directly to the national security establishment, the weapons manufacturers, that kind of stuff.
The breakdown of Bretton Woods, by the way, is a huge part of this whole story. It takes place under Nixon, but it's really, I think it's key to understanding what happened in Watergate, and what happened and why Reagan was able to do what he did. It's that the international financial system created after, towards the end of World War II, where there was a sort of soft gold standard where the US dollar was the reserve currency, but it was tethered to gold. And so if the US ran big payments deficits, these countries could ask for their dollars in gold, but that would drain the US Treasury, especially with Vietnam War spending. And so that leads to the collapse of the system and the closing of the gold window in 1971 under Nixon. But the US during this time, through a number of international and domestic political struggles, establishes this post-Bretton Woods system, which we still have today, which basically allows the dollar and US Treasury bills to replace gold in other countries' foreign currency reserves. They don't establish anything that is sort of equitable or tangible. And what this means, and they do this in part through requiring Saudi Arabia and other countries to only accept dollars for their oil. But what this means, because it gets established throughout the mid 70s and very early 80s, this system gets more or less consolidated. What it means is that the US can run huge budget deficits and without suffering big consequences, because everybody in the world accepts the dollar. And to the extent that it could lead to inflation, it's kind of exported to all these countries that are holding lots of dollars, for example. And so the US under Reagan becomes the world's biggest debtor, but the US has more power economically than it ever had before, because this creation of, they're in debt. The US is in a lot of debt because other countries own a lot of treasury bills because of US balance of payments deficits. However, the debt is in a currency that the US controls and can print as much of as it wants. And so it can't really suffer because of this debt. Like you can, if you give me control of a currency and then say that I owe a huge amount of money in that same currency that I can control, that doesn't really matter. It's like, that's a great position to be in. That's the position that the US has been in and has been defending, and that we kind of see unraveling now, I think. And I think that's why they're kind of freaking out about all of this business with Russia. But this is a big part of the story, and really a bigger kind of structural economic thing that will allow you to make sense of other aspects of US foreign policy, especially the war on terror effort to take control of the Middle East, and then the Arab Spring Wars that they tried to use with that. And the US, I think, has lost those. And so this is really what we're seeing now is the unwinding of the neocon dream of perpetual dominance forever. And it's exciting if you are wanting to see like international law prevail and a world with less imperialism outright in it. But it's worrisome because in trying to hold on to things, the US might blow up the world. And this is
that's the alarming thing. I think you hit the nail on the head earlier in the chat when you said, it can be so discouraging because of the massive entrenched power that exists, that it feels so insurmountable that you have to kind of hope that the answer is going to come internationally. And right now we're witnessing in real time this like rapidly, like exponentially increasing decline of US empire, and the exact hegemony that they tried to really entrench forever is kind of now slipping through their grasp. And you're seeing them lash out in all these different ways. That's, and like you said, I think you have to understand that framework to understand how they're acting on a number of levels right now, geopolitically.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a crisis, and it's very alarming. I mean, Obama, for all of his problems, was at least impressive enough person in terms of he seemed,
Yeah,
reasonably smart and well spoken. But the last two guys really represent, like, they can't find any in a country of 300 million people, the richest country in the world, and you can't find anyone more impressive than like Trump and Pence and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden
yeah,
to serve as even as figureheads. Like, you can't get anybody better than these people. I mean, that also reflects on how profound this decline is
yeah,
in the US. And so how did we get to these points? This is why the era of like the 60s and 70s is 50s, 60s, and 70s. These decades after World War II, I think, are really important and fascinating, and they hardly get covered in like high school history classes, or if
yeah.
they do, they're done very badly. And so this is what makes this kind of work, I think, really important.
Yeah, well, it's also they pump billions of dollars into creating mass media establishments to brainwash people, but then the result of that is like this whole generations of Americans that have been in this incredibly advanced like propaganda panopticon for their entire lives, and it's completely melted their brains. So
Yeah.
it's creating this population that's becoming more and more difficult for them to control because of how like completely poisoned everyone's minds have become from these generations of intense propaganda. From that is now, you can kind of choose which propaganda spout you want to access, but ultimately it's having the effect of just completely poisoning an entire generation of people and making it more increasingly difficult to control. Though. Yeah, and now they're getting involved in civilian government themselves, the people that have been brainwashed by this process.
Yeah, I mean, I really wonder what kind of cosmology some of these people have about the way the U.S. empire actually functions, because some of the things that they have done have been so dumb. I mean, the problem is what they really want is impossible, which is, or if it's going to be achieved, it's going to be achieved through means that are so horrible for humanity that it would be insane to even contemplate it. The U.S. wants to rule the world, and the U.S. elites want to rule the world, in perpetuity. They want a new American century, which is not in the offing.
No, the ship has already sailed. That's the thing.
Right. And so you really wonder, like, the propaganda myths about the U.S. and that the way that events get described in the New York Times and elsewhere. These are so detached from reality that you really wonder about what it's like at the higher circles. Like, somebody like Blinken does not strike me as a person who, I mean, if they're going to really run the empire, then they should understand it basically in the terms that I lay it out in. Like, you almost have to be a Marxist critic to understand what the state's even supposed to be doing, or otherwise you're just thinking in stupid platitudes and
baby
silly
talk
generalizations. And like, I don't like, does Blinken have like a private mode where like all of a sudden he just starts dropping all of this like really dark Machiavellian imperial knowledge about how things are or should be, or what? I mean, I can't figure out what these people are doing, because of the caliber of officials, at least in the public position, does not seem very high. And that more or less corresponds to the poor decisions that we're seeing being made all the time, even from a Machiavellian point of view. It just is, it's a mess.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It's all part of that decline. I won't keep you for too much longer because we've been talking for a while, but because the January 6th hearings are going on right now, and because we talked about how Trump was kind of the Trump era was an interesting part of this kind of phenomenon of the deep state. We had, of course, Trump's like highly publicized battle with the deep state and the ways that was kind of distorted the actual meaning of these power structures. But I think it is undeniable, though, that Trump did kind of butt heads with certain factions within the intelligence community, the national security establishment. I think especially at first, they weren't sure if they could control him. He was talking about things like breaking up NATO. He was talking about like getting the United States out of NATO and stuff. And that's like the red alert sound. When people start saying that kind of stuff, that really freaks these people out. I don't doubt that there were entrenched like people in these intelligence community structures that were trying to undermine him and stuff. And I think January 6th is an interesting it's an interesting one of these deep political events that we're talking about, because you have in the event itself, you have all these different factions of the security state present. You have the kind of like more establishment FBI types who are infiltrating these groups like the Proud Boys, like they do with all other extremist groups, and kind of help plan events that they then stop and then take credit for. You've got them deeply implicated in that. QAnon is a big part of this phenomenon that we, of course, these intelligence community types have their fingers in that. Certainly.
They have to.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, in January 6th, you have this kind of like more reactionary pro-Trump element of the police that is maybe sympathetic to Trump's claims about election theft. And you see these kinds of like different factions within the security state butting heads throughout the Trump administration, and then it kind of culminates in this January 6th incident. And now you have these hearings, which are obviously a lot of theater and a lot of propaganda and spin going into that. I was just wondering what is your takeaway from what has been going on with that, and like how does January 6th fit into this kind of puzzle?
Well, January 6th, like Russiagate, I have to confess, and this might seem surprising to you, but I have not been in the weeds of the details of either of these as they have unfolded.
Oh, me neither. No.
Because my sense with Russiagate was accurate and was borne out was that like this is just an excuse to explain away Hillary's failure and to save the corporate Democrats so that you don't have everybody talking about, hey, that's what happens when you don't elect Sanders, who the people actually like. And so on. And it's like a way for the Democrats not to have to acknowledge that they are not a party that deserves the name Democrat, because they are really undemocratic. In essence, they serve a tiny minority of oligarchs. So they should call themselves the oligarchic party. And that Russiagate was designed to distract away from that, and also to sandbag Donald Trump, who was making noises about having better relations with Russia. And we now see that with what's happened with Ukraine, we see how hell-bent the U.S. is on confronting Russia, if we didn't know that already. And January 6th, my sense of it is that I don't know what happened exactly with all of this business. Peter Del Scott we wrote a little bit about this in part 3 of our 9/11 series for Covert Action Magazine, which I'm going to republish with expanded versions of it on AmericanException.com. I'm hoping to do that. But Peter talks about the role of continuity of government elements in the way that things unfolded there, and that this is something that happens in the JFK assassination, in Watergate, Iran-Contra. You have parts of the government that are empowered with like secret emergency powers in their own communications network, and they seem to emerge during these in different ways that we can't ever get to the bottom of during these time periods. And they act with some kind of emergency authorization to do whatever needs to be done, and who knows what they plan beforehand and or what they do in the moment when responding to these crises. But the January 6th thing, on the surface, the obvious thing that I thought at the time was that there's no way that this should be happening. This is, you can't organize a group of people like this on the internet without the security services being aware of it. So to some extent, it had to have been allowed to happen. And I don't think that it's because everybody that did that was responsible for the way it went down, that everybody was actually doing it to advance a pro-Trump agenda, because it did not advance a pro-Trump agenda. It was a disaster for Trump political forces. And to the extent that he was involved in it, you really wonder who was advising what to Trump and what advice did he take on this score. But how the way that it did go down just seems to be that it had to have been allowed to happen to a certain degree. And this is borne out by the plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, right? And that it turns out to be pretty much what you were saying, an FBI plot where the FBI swoops in and says, all right, we saved the day from ourselves.
This is what they did throughout the War on Terror with disaffected, angry Muslim teenagers or whatever, just convincing them
mentally ill, or
exactly, and convincing them to commit crimes and then swooping in and saving the day, or not saving the day in some certain cases.
This is a huge scandal. This goes, it probably goes back further than this. I'm sure it does. But the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, where an FBI informant took the step of recording his conversations with his FBI handler, and that's the only reason we know this. But he had said, hey, I can switch out the powder for this bomb to a harmless powder, and then the bombing won't happen. He was told specifically not to do that by the FBI. Okay, and this came out, should have been a
Very
huge scandal,
curious. Yeah.
and it wasn't. So did something like that happen similarly? And I'm not saying this as a pro-Trump person. I'm just saying that
No.
Trump, because he's not completely on board with this liberal, quote unquote, liberal internationalist project of global capitalism, that he's more of a nationalist and makes strange statements about ending NATO from the perspective of the establishment, and wants better relations with Russia, that these things were unacceptable to him or to the establishment. And so Trump was kind of a gross aberration. Hillary and company thought it'd be good to have Trump running. They actually said, like, yeah, let's get this guy in there. Let's help the Republicans get Trump as the nominee because he'll be really easy to defeat. But they underestimated how much people hate Hillary and the establishment in general. And then all of a sudden you end up with President Trump. And he did say things about trying to deal with the deep state and the establishment in the United States. Washington Post wrote that Trump was the first president since Nixon to try to take on the CIA, which is a very fascinating admission. You had Chuck Schumer going on the talk shows saying, oh, the CIA, they can get back at you 6 ways from Sunday. You don't want to mess with them, Mr. President. And it's like, how crazy is that you're saying this in a democracy, that you're telling the president not to mess with the security services that are supposedly a part of the executive branch? I mean, how is this not remarked upon more by people? So, Trump did confront these people to some degree in his own hand-fisted way. And
part of it was just bullshit. All the stuff about leaving NATO. I don't think he had ever had any intention of doing that. And a lot of that was just complete bullshit to appeal to this kind of crowd and to kind of stir the pot and get publicity, but I can see why that was still threatening to people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I think is happening now is that the US has kind of lost it's a rearguard action for US hegemony. And Trump didn't really do too much to change the status quo one way or the other, but international events did. And losing in Syria, that was a part of the US regime change effort to deal with this arc of resistance of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and then Lebanon, Hezbollah controlled parts of Lebanon. That this failed. And it seems like what they really want to do is, okay, if you're not going to be able to establish the unipolar world forever, then can we somehow recreate the bipolar world where China and Russia are boogeymen, and we can get the rest of the world to trade with us, and we'll sort of prosper independently under American hegemony, going forward. But I don't think that they're going to be able to do that. I don't think that the US has any goodwill left in the developing world this time around. And I think that China and Russia are much more powerful vis-a-vis the US than they were during the Cold War. And so I think that these crazy events that we're seeing represent the ways that the regime is trying to respond to really existential crises for the US empire. And hopefully these crises do threaten the US empire, but not the US nation state, and that it can lead to something like what the Chinese have been talking about. The extent they pursue this, who knows, but it's debatable, but more so than the US, which is a system characterized by the observance of international law and win-win relationships between powerful states and weaker states, which is what they're calling for and advocating. Yep. And they do build infrastructure in African countries where the US and the European former colonizers never did a damn thing. China has done some things. I'm not trying to give them a halo, but compared to what the US does, I don't see how you can argue that it's not an improvement for the global South to have a China to do business with.
Well, this is what I've been saying recently. It's you look at what US officials say about this, and they look at countries in Latin America or Africa signing on to the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's remarkable because they just throw up their hands, and you can see these people going, why is this happening? Why are they going with the Chinese rather than us? And it really is amazing. You talked about people like Blinken, the people are you aware of how completely full of shit all of this is? Or are you a true believer or what? Because you see these people and they really don't understand why this is happening. And it's really not that difficult to understand. Like you pointed out, people no matter where you are, people in Latin America and Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, they're all very familiar with Yankee imperialism and what that is, and what it means to take a deal with the IMF versus taking a deal with the Chinese government. They're very familiar with this decades long process that these deep political events have been part of like entrenching this kind of power structure. The global south is very familiar, has been the primary victim of all these machinations, and I think these cultures are very, very familiar with that. And now that they see this new opportunity to develop outside of that system, and they can kind of unapologetically join that and not have to kind of like do what the United States tells them to do, of course they're taking that deal. It's like the most logical thing in the world, but these U.S. officials just can't wrap their minds around why these developing nations are making this decision. You know, it's really remarkable.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you can't overstate the brutality of imperialism, and U.S. imperialism also as a part of that, entire phenomenon historically of human imperialism. The case of Indonesia in 1965, America has gone way to the right since 1965. But if you look at what they did in Indonesia in 1965, which is really the culmination of decades of groundwork laid by Alan Dulles, we have a whole video series about this that's getting towards the 1965 finale. It's on YouTube, and I also have it on my American Exception podcast on Patreon. But this is the Alan Dulles knew back in the 1930s that the world's biggest gold mine, potentially, or gold deposit, was in West Papua, which was loosely controlled by the Netherlands, but not really. The Nazis and the Japanese had designs on it at different times. And they finagled this at the end of the Cold War, or during the Cold War, after World War II, to eventually overthrow Sukarno, who was a nationalist, in order to put in a U.S. puppet and allow Freeport Sulphur, which is a Rockefeller company.
Someone who Kennedy met with and supported, by the way,
yes,
prior
Kennedy
to his assassination.
Sukarno. And Alan Dulles never told Kennedy that the world's biggest gold mine was in the biggest gold mine in human history was in West Papua, during this whole dispute over what would happen to West Papua, which unfolded under Kennedy, and under Eisenhower, but it was really resolved under Kennedy. And he had no clue about this. And the U.S., I think in part to make sure that the Indonesian policy was changed, that's a part of the reason why they kill Kennedy. And in 1965, they stage this bizarre coup that fails, and it's used as the CIA was almost certainly behind that, this weird event involving the murder of generals who were by pro-Sukarno forces. And it allows for this huge massacre of the Indonesian, Marxists, communists, the PKI, but they were really just like peasants who wanted land. I mean, they were really poor landless peasants, not part of some coherent global
like trade unionists and women's groups, and just anyone that was remotely part of that, connected to that more socialist leaning movement, anti-colonial movement.
They tortured them and they tortured them to death. Maybe at least 500,000, some estimates go as high as 3 million. And they did this to enable the theft, the expropriation of massive amounts of wealth in Indonesia, and to have, geopolitical hegemony in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and control one of the most lucrative spots in the world in terms of resources, the biggest gold mine in human history. And so the idea that these Rockefeller types represent any sort of like liberal internationalism or benign commercial, whatever, that is just belied by this. That when it comes down to it, they would kill 1 million people just to steal their gold, literally. And this is what we're dealing with. And it's a mini version of the history of human imperialism. It's not that the U.S. is in intention and in its constitution, in its inner constitution, so much different or worse than other empires. It's not. It's just the U.S. had more power than any other empire in human history.
Yeah, they modernized it.
Yes, and so this is what we're dealing with, and we need to have more people aware of what imperialism is and what our role has been in this, so that we might, move humanity forward by changing the way we organize human society. Yeah.
Well, I think, it gets at something that Tucker Carlson was talking about the other night. I mean, it's like talking about also someone that is quite possibly a CIA asset, Tucker Carlson, who sometimes gets credibility from these types as being like, oh, he's on the right, but he talks about these anti-imperialist views. And he said something really revealing the other night about China, saying, oh, they'll be cruel masters when they're in charge, not like us. Right. But I reject that. I don't believe that, frankly. And that's why I think it's important to learn this history and really understand that we're not, the empire is not this benevolent thing that made a few mistakes or did things.
Yeah.
did some things wrong, but ultimately had good intentions. I mean, people have to deprogram themselves from accepting this idea. That's exactly why I try to make the link between the rise of fascism, World War II, the importation of all these fascists into the United States government, reestablishing fascism in West Germany and Japan, linking that to the Kennedy assassination and Vietnam and Indonesia and all this stuff, because I think it's a way to make people understand we're not dealing with people that had good intentions that made mistakes, but this is an evil project to institute this this global hegemony at the using ruthless violence and suppression in order to accomplish this. It's like really something a horrific thing that we need to reckon with the evil of that before we can kind of have an informed understanding about anything that's happening right now currently.
Yeah, and it's really, it goes back to capitalism. If you want to trace capitalism back, I wouldn't personally trace it back to like the merchants of like Venice and stuff. They were into commerce, but they weren't really capitalists in the same way as what emerges in England with the enclosure movement, which created population pressures because it took all the land for the sheep for the textile industry. And this helps to fuel the conquest of Ireland during this time, and then even further west to the New World in America. And the U.S. was set up as a capitalist venture. The Massachusetts Bay Company, the Virginia Company, these were joint stock companies trying to make a buck.
Yeah, Canada as well.
Colonies that way. And so this is what it's so from the beginning, capitalism, it expropriates its own people in England, and then it has to go out and find other places to plunder and do business with, plunder people and markets and resources. So it goes to Ireland and then to the United States, and then spreads across the entire continent of North America. And then once that's done, at the end of the 1800s, the U.S. starts to go into the Pacific and expand kind of internationally. Gets involved in World War I, gets involved in World War II, and at that point sets up this global empire. But it's all a continuation of like capitalism, which has been pretty brutal from the beginning, with the genocide of the Indians, the genocidal campaigns in Ireland, the Atlantic slave trade, and then Western Europe, capitalist powers are practicing colonialism all around the world, dominating the global South. So the capitalism has been the driving force, and it's inextricable from imperialism. This is where libertarians are just totally clueless about this. They dream of some peaceful capitalism, but it's never ever been that way.
And we talked about when you think without Marx, how ridiculous you sound, and that's part of it, isn't it?
That's when you just take out capitalism, and then you're like, well, the government, because there are libertarians who will be like, yeah, the government murdered JFK because they're the government and they want power. So this is like the actual thinking of it. It's very silly, but if you take out capitalism, but it's like, if that's your cosmology, then you just are like somebody who's in the Middle Ages talking about the Ptolemaic, structure of the universe. It's like everything is going to be wrong if you're fundamentally wrong about these aspects. And so capitalism versus like socialism, who knows what kind of form would be ideal? But if it's just, let's just put it in the most generic terms, should society be subordinated to the interests of capital, or should capital be subordinated to the interests of society? We have the first system, I think, and that is not working out very well, because if you organize everything about how people with money can make more money, you're going to end up with a messed up civilization, and that's what we have. And so if you allow these concentrations of wealth to exist, they will inevitably be corrupt. I think that's been borne out. And so we need to recognize that and figure out where to go from there if we're going to survive as a species or any kind of decent civilization.
Okay, well, Aaron, that's a good place to leave it. That's a whole separate conversation getting into that. But I really appreciate you coming on the program. As you can tell, I love talking about this shit. So it was great to chat with you about all of this, all these deep political events. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us today. It was great.
No problem.
It was great.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, do you want to just plug one last time, plug your book or plug the podcast or anything else you want to talk about?
For sure. My book is out now. You can get it wherever books are sold. You can just Google American Exception, or web search, I should say. I don't really like to promote that company, but I do it reflexively. But American Exception, Empire in the Deep State is the book. It was my PhD dissertation. It's out now. It's been rewritten to be less academic sounding compared to the dissertation. And I recommend that you read that if you want to understand how academia has failed to really address these problems, and how the post-World War II American empire evolved with criminality as a key component of the way that we've been able to govern. I say we, I don't know why I say we, the way our regime has operated with lawlessness in the US and state crimes overseas that we know about, like coups and so on, that have been exposed over the years. Also probably domestically, almost certainly with, the Kennedy assassinations, MLK assassination, and so on. So that's all in the book. And we talk about these issues on my podcast, which is on Patreon. And it's called American Exception. And that we have interviews with people like Oliver Stone, Dan Ellsberg, Peter Dale Scott, Peter Kuznick, Jeff Morley, David Talbot, John Newman, Jim Diogenio, Lisa Pease, all kinds of people talking about the issues related to deep politics, US imperialism, and so on. So I really recommend that you check that out. And we also have AmericanException.com, the website. And shortly, we're going to be publishing an article of Peter Dale Scott's that was stolen by the CIA. I am more categorical about that. Peter is like saying, well, we don't know exactly what, but he mailed his article to Ramparts magazine in 1970, and they stole it from him, intercepted it, and it never got to Ramparts. And somehow the CIA posted it on its website before they took it down. I downloaded it. It's been taken down, but I did download it, and we're going to do a version of it at AmericanException.com with a new preface from the author that's coming up soon. So you can check that out too. I'm doing more now online because I'm too radical for the university by my own reckoning, although maybe that'll change. But that's why I decided to go and make a podcast, because it's, what are you going to do when you want to do this work, but you're too radical?
Yeah, that's exactly why I have a Twitch stream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got to try to make it here, and whatever opportunities they still have, although it's worrisome.
That's right.
Worrisome.
That's why I've been
about Patreon and everything.
Yeah, that's why I've been very careful what I've been saying over the last couple of months, because I've seen this wave of censorship that I was describing earlier. So I wish you the best of luck in continuing to try to navigate that in the weeks and months moving forward. You're welcome back anytime, Aaron, to come on the show. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rob. It was great talking to you, and thanks to your audience.
All right.
Peace.
Take care. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Aaron Good, everyone. That was great.